Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's Lunch and Learn. If you joined by Polycom and registered in E-Train and train, email EPR training at bdh.virginia.gov following the Lunch and Learn in order to be verified and trained. I'm Dr. Dwight Flamia, State Public Health Toxicologist. I'm going to give a little presentation on the BDH Chemical Response Plan. I'm going to first start off with what we know about chemicals, go over a couple of actual chemical incidences and responses to them, and then also we'll talk about the chemical response plan. So first, I'll start off with what do we do, me and my staff do as public health toxicologists. Well, we advise on matters pertaining to hazards in the environment and how they may impact the public. When we talk about hazards, we're talking about things such as chemical, biological, and non-ionizing radiation, which includes things such as cell towers and power lines. We collect and distribute information concerning hazards to government agencies, political subdivisions, and local health departments. We issue fish consumption advisories or bans in response to chemical contaminations of fish and waterways, and we also provide consultation to emergency operations centers during environmental accidents. So what do we know about chemicals? Well, we know there's thousands of them. We also know that we don't have reference doses or daily doses or acceptable doses that people can be exposed to for all of them. However, for those that we rarely come into contact with or that are found in our environment or around us more than others, we do have information on those. And we're all familiar with the phrase that's the dose that makes the poison, but there's a lot that goes into that simple phrase. For example, you have to take in consideration, is the individual being exposed by inhalation, ingestion, or is it some kind of dermal contact? For most of the emergency chemical responses that we think of in our mind or that we see on the news or in the newspaper, we see big plumes of smoke or chemicals shooting into the air. Most people are being, in the general public, are going to be exposed to inhalation. When we then look at the duration, most of these chemical emergencies and responses that we participate in are acute or short term. And usually the general public is going to be exposed to chemicals at doses that are going to be much higher than what's found in the background. A lot of times these adverse health effects are short term and the body can compensate for them and return back to normal. This you can compare with things that may be at background level or lower than background levels, and you're exposed to them over many, many years or a lifetime that end up developing into cancer. Lastly, one of the others is frequency. An example of that is, so you are somebody who, let's say, drinks 5 beverages or alcoholic beverages on New Year's Eve, the 4th of July, and maybe during Thanksgiving when you have family and friends over to your house. Compare this to the individual who ingests the same dose but instead does it monthly. Compare that to the individual who does it every weekend, and there are people who do this more frequently and ingest up to 5 alcoholic beverages daily. So it's the same dose, but you can see where it's more than just a dose. The liver is going to have a bigger response to the individual that is ingesting alcohol more frequently. So what are some of the questions and answers that we have for chemical releases? Well, we know that most chemicals are released at fixed facilities. And by this, I mean things that include where chemicals are used, stored, manufactured. It also includes things where methamphetamine is made illegally, such as in an individual's home. In Virginia, we have over 4,000 what are called Tier 2 facilities. A Tier 2 facility is a facility that's required to maintain safety data sheets. This safety data sheets are what used to be called MSDS, or material data safety sheets, and are great to have because they provide chemical specific information on health effects, the reactivity of the chemical, and also how to clean up the chemical, and a host of other things, its fate and transport in the environment, and many other things. The other thing is, across the United States, there's several hundred industries that have hazardous material that are situated in where there's populations of 100,000 or more people. So what about transportation accidents? Well, when there's a transportation accident, it's usually transporting a chemical from, point A to point B. It's usually either highways or on railroad lines. And these are the ones where you're going to have the most impact on the public, because these aren't workers at a fixed facility. These are the general public, that use these modes or these highway corridors, just like those that are using it to transport chemicals. So the next question, how are chemicals released? Well, what we know is that most are done accidentally, followed by human error. And lastly, we know that less than 1% are actually intentional. Another interesting one that's sometimes overlooked is the weather's role in how chemicals are released. We know that back in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina and Rita hit Louisiana and Texas, that they resulted in 166 chemical releases in those states combined. And lastly, when do chemical releases occur? Data shows that most chemical releases occur during the daytime. It's usually between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And in Virginia, let me back up and say that data from 2010 showed that there was over 200 fixed facility releases and 85 transportation releases. So you may say, well, we rarely see that many reported. So what I want to get to next is the fact that when chemicals are released, that usually result in the health department being involved. It's usually going to be right around Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Thanksgiving is usually, it seems that when we end up getting a phone call that something has happened. So one of the biggest chemical release happened in India. It was at a pesticide manufacturing plant where 40 metric tons of methyl isocyanate was released in the middle of the night while the community was sleeping. It ended up injuring 100,000 and killing close to 3,000 individuals. And one of the reasons why there was a high incident of deaths was not necessarily, of course, the chemical itself is very toxic, but some chemicals, you may have an initial response, which for most people, when they're exposed, it's going to be a respiratory symptoms and or eye irritation. So this happened to many of the individuals in India, which then they overcome these effects and then they believe that everything's, back to normal. And then come to find out 2 to 3 days later, the lungs start filling with fluid and the people die of pulmonary edema. But this and other events led to the U.S. Congress passing the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in 1986. This act mandated that EPA keep a list of all extremely hazardous substances and mandated that all fire departments have a list of all hazardous materials or safety data sheets of all hazardous materials in their community, and also a list of extremely hazardous materials be made publicly available in each community. So a lot of the data that we have comes from the hazardous substance emergency evaluation system, which was from 1990 to 2009. This later changed, and that was based on a couple of dozen states that actually were providing this information so that we could learn from these sorts of things. In 2010, it switched from HSEES to the National Toxic Surveillance Incidents Program. The report that I looked at were the ones from 2010 to 2014. After that, it's no longer funded. Unfortunately, it was only a handful of states participating at that time. But what we know that remains consistent is that in fixed facilities, the chemicals, I guess, that are usually released are either natural gas, carbon monoxide, and ammonia. For those that are released during transportation, usually the chemicals that are released are your acids and bases. I'd like to point out chlorine, though, is the most toxic of all of them. And keep in mind that when chlorine is released and people are exposed to it, it's usually the one that's going to result in the most fatalities. So let's talk about a couple of facts. 75% of incidents are usually occur at fixed facilities. Less than 10% of all chemical incidents result in hospital admissions. More than 50% impacted are employees, which goes hand in hand with most accidents occurring at fixed facilities. And also respiratory and eye irritation are reported more than any other adverse health effect. So I'm going to go through now 4 or 5 examples of chemicals that are commonly released during these responses that we're talking about. We'll start with ammonia. So ammonia is a gas that's used in making fertilizers. It's also stolen for the use of making methamphetamine. It's also a refrigerant in a lot of big places that need refrigeration, grocery stores, processing plants. So in 2014 in Edinburgh, Virginia, ammonia leaked from the roof of a facility, worked its way down, sending 6 employees to seeking medical care. However, 1 was only needed to be treated at the local hospital. 12 homes were evacuated. And the reason why I'm highlighting this one is one of the reasons is all of these big facilities usually have their own hazmat response team. They always call in the fire department because the fire department, the fire chief is your incident commander during a chemical or emergency response, chemical response. They did contact the Virginia Department of Emergency Management just to make sure that the fire chief did, just to make sure that what the hazmat for the facility was reporting being done, was they thought was acceptable. Chlorine is a World War I gas. It's used to make plastics. It's used by water treatment. It's a yellow greenish gas. It's heavier than air, so it forms a cloud that stays low to the ground. So a couple of scenarios was, both were train derailments. The one in South Carolina released 60 tons over 2 days or 3 days. When that happened, the fire chief issued a shelter in place. Shelter in place means go stay where you are, close the door, close the windows, and turn off any heating and air conditioning, and don't leave the building. This is one of the few ones where people actually decided to, decided to leave, and when they were leaving, they were actually intercepted by the police and medical personnel and actually brought to decontamination sites to be decontaminated. People that lived within a quarter of a mile, 7 people died. People that were a half mile, only 2 deaths were reported. And the reason for this is chlorine is kind of like what I was talking about with the India incidents, where you don't necessarily die from exposure right then. The injury that it has on the lung could actually manifest itself a day or 2 later. So therefore, this is one of the challenges for a health department, is keeping track of people who have been exposed to hazardous substances in the environment. The one in Florida is interesting because the train the accident from the train that released the chlorine gas, it actually was on a hill. So the chlorine gas made its way down the hill to a highway that was at the bottom of the hill. So the chlorine, replaced the oxygen in the air. So cars that were passing through it couldn't combust like they should, and ended up stalling, and it resulted in 88 injuries and 8 deaths. Sulfuric acid is the most produced chemical in the United States. It's used from everything from fertilizers to petroleum purification, and also to make explosives. So we talk about what happened in Tennessee is a very interesting one, where another train derailment, it shot sulfuric acid 3,000 feet into the air. It happened on a nice Sunday afternoon. The challenge to that was most people were either at church or out enjoying the day. There was also a fishing tournament going on and a bike-led charity event at the same time. So it was, a challenge to get the word out to the public about what had happened. They used a 911 reverse call. They also used media such as radio and television to get the word out. One of the notable things that happened was that people, when they were noted, they weren't allowed to go back to their homes. So people were told to evacuate. So can imagine being at church, somebody telling you that you can't go back home. You have to leave the area. You have a number of people that don't have medication. You also have pets and animals that are going to be stranded at home. This became a big challenge for the sheriff's office to maintain this. However, the people that were treated were released. Again, major complaints and illness, reported was respiratory distress and eye irritation. Essentially, the same sort of thing happened in Utah. I won't go into any great detail with that, other than saying, as you can see, it's always a large number of people that you're going to have to be worried about, that you're going to have to monitor or keep track of, and have to maybe even do follow-up depending on, how many people are actually exposed. So vinyl chloride, this is a compound that's used, 98% of it's used to just manufacture PVC, which is polyvinyl chloride. A lot of our home plumbing has it in it. There's a train derailment in New Jersey. This one is interesting because where the train derailed, it was over a bridge, and it actually leaked into the waterway underneath and got 18 people sick at a marine terminal. Half mile was around it was evacuated. The other thing is vinyl chloride is extremely soluble in water, so therefore it's going to stay in any surface water. You have to take into consideration, is that going to impact any waterworks down the street or anyone using that as a source water for drinking? It's going to get into groundwater. It's very mobile in groundwater. And then we can turn our attention to the train derailment in Ohio that happened a couple of months ago. This one is interesting. Excuse me. First of all, the reports aren't finished that summarize everything that went on. So a lot of it is what you find on the internet. So I'll go with this. So far there haven't been any injuries that are reported. We do know that there was almost 24 cars that were carrying hazardous material. Several of them actually contained vinyl chloride. According to some, one of the things that led to this distrust with the agencies responding to it was that, originally it was only supposed to be one car that was going to, one way of getting rid of the vinyl chloride was actually burn it, which resulted in a big plume of smoke in the air. However, they ended up burning 5 different cars. It was also complicated by the fact that most people don't know that it happened right on the other side of Pennsylvania. So you have Pennsylvania also addressing it and having their own fact sheets. I haven't gone into looking to see if there's any differences of opinion between what Ohio put out and Pennsylvania. I'm sure they spoke with the same voice, but it's something to keep in mind, being that Virginia, we are surrounded by several other states, or we border several other states. But anyway, so they did their controlled burn of the vinyl chloride. There's also other chemicals that were being released into the air. One of the state U.S. senators actually asked if EPA could test for dioxin, which is a very toxic material. EPA said that it wasn't going to do that. We also know that when you burn vinyl chloride, it's easy for media to report, produces hydrochloric acid, carbon monoxide, other things that you expect would burn, but also produces phosgene. And we know that phosgene is another chemical warfare agent. However, in this instance, my understanding is that the phosgene that is, if it all produces in small amounts. So I'm going to have 2 more points with the Ohio one. So actually, I got a phone call or an email from a lady in Southwest Virginia who said, I'm very concerned about what's happening in Ohio. This plume of smoke is making its way across the mountaintops. I responded to her, how do you know this? Where are you hearing your information from? And she said she got it off of social media. So that's one of the roles. That's one of the things that we have to deal with social media. Of course, EPA is monitoring it, and the Department of Environmental Quality is well aware of it. So I directed her email to them to respond. Another one, a week after that, a lady in Tidewater called me to tell me that vinyl chloride had got into the groundwater in Ohio, and it was making its way down to the Tidewater in Virginia Beach, and that we were all blankety blank blanks, and she hung up on me. So the point is, the internet can be your friend or your worst enemy when it comes to these types of things. I'm going to talk a little quickly about PFAS. The reason for this is because it's not one of those chemicals where you see it's being spewed or burned or released into the air to any great extent that causes an emergency, a response right then and there. But the interesting part of this is these compounds that don't really break down. They're kind of like the squatter of chemicals when it comes to being found in the environment. They're used for all kinds of things. They're found in practically everybody if you ever were sampled for it, and if you look hard enough, you're going to find it practically everywhere. But the interesting thing to share is that it was Newport News Water Works was looking through their source water, and they detected PFAS. And they worked their way all along the Chickahominy River and found that, it was actually detected up as far as the Richmond Airport. And they shared this information with the Department of Environmental Quality and also with the local health department, Henrico. So they contacted the VDH, and what we did was we decided to set up a joint incident command, which is something to always think about, because you can then tap on resources that others have that you may not have. You're also making sure that everybody's speaking with one voice, and it's a better way to approach any kind of chemical release. So if you're looking for VDH, I'm going to talk about the actual chemical response plan, which was developed back when my office used to be in the Office of Epidemiology. To find it, it's on the intranet. So you should try to take the time to look at it at least once, because there may come a time when you need it, and if you don't have access to the intranet, you won't, be able to find it or get it. But it's essentially in the Office of Emergency Preparedness. You then go to the Emergency Planning and Strategic National Stockpile on the top right, and inside that it'll open up a couple of drop-down boxes. If you select the base plan and annexes, you can see where it says the epidemiological response. And underneath that, table 2, I didn't mean to say that. That's where you'll find most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. It's 43, 46 pages of a lot of useful information. I'm not going to be able to do it justice today, but I'll give it my best shot. It contains all kinds of things about basics of chemical agents. It talks about best ways to plan and be prepared for these events. One of the things that's a lot of times overlooked is the recovery phase. It has a good section on that. Of course, it has a great section on how you should respond during the event phase. And also it has a good reporting form at the end. Some of the forms that in the appendix are very good. One is the one that you can use to help capture pertinent information that can then be used to write an event notification. So it has a lot of great epi stuff in it. Goes over surveillance, the role of people that are doing surveillance and data collection, the investigation part, which is finding and defining the exposed population, collecting and tracking specimens, and also information, which is essentially sharing and providing knowledge to others that may be part of the response plan. Another great section is identifying a chemical release. So how we identify or become aware of chemical releases can come in 3 different ways. One is during the emergency response, where there's actually something that happens right then and there. Something happened to my screen.
1 second.
Did everybody see in the PowerPoint presentation?
Hold on. Share. Okay. There.
All right. Excuse me, I believe we're back. So I was talking about how we identify chemical releases at the health department. One is they come to us via sources such as the fire department, Virginia Department of Emergency Management. It could also come to us from a hazmat team responding at a fixed incident, or maybe even through media outlets. Another way is through surveillance, which could either be passive or active surveillance. We've actually gotten a couple times where the Poison Control Center has contacted us because they monitor hospital and emergency room data too, and has alerted us to an increase in the number of patients that have above baseline carbon monoxide exposure. And thirdly, would be environmental sampling, which is kind of what I was speaking about with the PFAS incidents with the Chickahominy River. So the plan has a lot of information about chemical indicators of chemical exposures. For the most part, people that are exposed to chemicals, the general public, like I have mentioned, is, it's going to be, through things that are in the air. So we're going to see a lot of breathing problems and eye irritation. Some others include failure of like common disease to respond to a usual therapy, higher morbidity, mortality. It's actually it's worth your time to look at these indicators of chemical exposures, particularly if you're going to be find yourself working somewhere at like a 3-day rock concert or at a Boy Scout jamboree or maybe even at the state fair. So next, look briefly at agency roles. So when it comes to chemical release, the local health department is going to lead BDH's response effort. Again, the local fire department, the fire chief would be the incident commander. The Office of Epidemiology, the state epidemiologist would be the one, if necessary, to activate the Virginia Emergency Coordination Center if needed. Other participants would be DCLS as our primary testing laboratory. And then there's a list of other state agencies that may be involved or may even take a leading role or participate in a joint incident command, excuse me, if needed. And then we have a list of our federal partners. One of the main thing, another thing that the emergency response plan goes into is notification, which is essentially the take-home message that you should have. As soon as you hear about something, you should have an open dialogue with your supervisor, and there should be an open communication between the local health department and state offices. So because you don't know what sort of resources each other have, and you shouldn't assume that, the one or the other knows exactly what's happening. For example, like sometimes I'll get notifications from ATSDR, which is the toxicology people at the CDC. And the reason for that is because they work hand in hand with their environmental partners who are EPA. So EPA is one of the first to know about emergency releases. They tell them, and sometimes it comes to me. I would alert my supervisor and also pass it along to the local health department. So that's kind of a good practice to keep in mind. But more specifically, if we want to discuss local health department roles, the local health department would be, the ones providing background and define the release and provide any event notification and updates. They maintain contact with the first responders and update the events, respond to citizens and media, collect samples to be analyzed, follow up with the community, excuse me, not just those that are hospitalized, coordinate with the Red Cross, help provide emotional trauma, and of course be there to assist with the local government, what their needs are, maybe even taking an active role in responding to things that the local government may wish you to respond to. Sometimes we found where some communities, the local government would rather just do their own response to a lot of the things. But again, having that open communication, you make sure that you're all speaking with the same voice. So what's some of the roles that the central office will play? It's identifying public health impacts posed by the agents. It's also making sure that we're aware of, by knowing what's out there, how people are exposed, learning from what the guys at the local health or what people at the local health department tell us, we can determine, based on the exposure, is this going to be something that's just going to be acute, or do we expect anything to happen over, chronically or some long-term down the road. We also, the central office will help with coordinating sample collection. The central office, we all have a bunch of federal agencies that we work with for various reasons, and we can tap into those resources when needed. We help with monitoring during and after release, responding and coordinating with our state and federal agencies, recommending actions for reducing any ongoing exposures, and can help with determining, particularly when it's safe to return home. And that has a lot to take into account with, although, the plume of smoke may be gone from the air, if it's something that gets into the ground and gets into the groundwater, we may, want to be there and work with the local health department to make sure that we actively are sampling any potable wells nearby to make sure that the people that are using that over an extended period of time, that, there's no chemical left in the groundwater that may impact those drinking water sources. The central office, particularly DSI, Division of Surveillance and Investigation, can coordinate sample collection and analysis between department or Division of Consolidated Laboratories. Others that play roles in this is the Office of Environmental Health Services, and also the Office of Drinking Water can help assist with coordinating with collecting samples. DSI and the tox program can help actually tell you what are the better samples that should be collected, what type of sample kits, sampling methodology, and how things should be stored, should it be under ice, maybe something doesn't another be that way. Do we want to have a chain of custody, which sometimes is would be important if it was a terrorist attack. And then you also have the recovery and post-event phase, which a lot of people are, once I guess, the main event is over, a lot of people forget about this part of a chemical response. But it's important to make sure that we're still there to help with the community, that dealing with any laws, making sure everybody has access to food, shelter, and water, making sure that we know that it's safe for people to actually re-enter, the environment, such as their homes, schools, and so on. And lastly, there's never going to be any shortage of media attention or public interest when there's a chemical release. Your best bet is always keep your public information officer abreast of the situation and work with them with getting out the appropriate message. So what are some of the key messages? Although technology has changed over the year on how we contact people, the key messages really haven't. And there's things that we should be able to tell or that people are going to want to know. They're going to want to know what happened, what does VDH know, and also what they should be doing. And this is another one of those documents that's nice to have, and there's one that's in the chemical response plan where it's been filled out. It's essentially all you need to do is put the name of the place where it happened, the name of the chemical, and pretty much the rest of the language is already there for you. It's a great starting template. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. I know I went over a few minutes. Here's some context. The main is if you go to the Office of Emergency Preparedness, that contact information is actually on the World Wide Web. And that link that's provided in it, you can see where it lists a whole bunch of people. One that I forgot to talk about is the emergency coordinators for the districts and the regional offices. They of course will play a great role in making sure that communications are open and resources are used appropriately. And with that, that's the end of my talk.
Any question?
Is there any questions? If so, just make sure you turn if you're on mute, make sure you unmute your phone. And lastly, if you think of questions after this, you can always email toxicology@vdh.virginia.gov, and that'll come to me rather than having to worry about how to spell my name. Again, that's toxicology@vdh.virginia.gov.
Thank you.